Joseph Vance. Most folks call me Willy or Willy Jay. I was born on April 6, 1869, in Scott County, Virginia, the only child of George Washington Vance and Rebecca Crabtree. My father George was born in 1814, in Washington, Virginia. My mother Rebecca was born in 1836, in Lee County, Virginia. When they married in 1854, my mother was 22 years younger than my father. My father was a stone and brick mason. I had a hunger to see the world, and in my early 20s I set out to do just that. I married Ella Blanche Adams on June 12, 1893, at age 24 in Abilene, Texas. She was 18 years old when we married, 6 years younger than me. We had 10 children: Lillian, James Otis, Aura, Maud, George, Ella May, Troy, Geneva, Sybil, and Bessie.
Both Frank and Bess Gates were born in Texas, approximately 300 miles from one another, so they probably ended up together in McAlester, New Mexico, purely by chance. Bess's father, Willy Jay Vance, had a fever for wanderlust and never seemed to stay too long in one place. He and Bess's mother, Ella, hauled their large family from place to place every few years, even spending 6 months in Canada once. By the time Bess was 4 in 1900, the family was living in West Virginia, not far from where Willy Jay was born. When his father, George Washington Vance, died, he was only 11 years old, and he became the man of the house, providing for himself and his mother, Rebecca Crabtree Vance. No matter where he was, Willy Jay always saw to it that his mother was cared for. She died in West Virginia in 1998, which may have prompted the move back to West Virginia from Texas. The family would go on to live in Oklahoma and Sumner, Kansas, before ending up in New Mexico, where Bessie Vance would meet Frank Gates. In Sumner, Kansas, Willy Jay operated a grain silo with a partner, and it was said that it was common to find Willy Jay and his partner arguing politics while walking down the street. January 6, 1922, found Willy's daughter, Bess, in McAlester, New Mexico, waiting at the altar, along with other members of the Gates and Vance families, for Frank Gates to show up for his own wedding. By the time he arrived, Bess was out of her mind, thinking he had chickened out and wasn't going to show. As it turns out, a day late and a few dollars short might have been a metaphor for what her life with him would be. Sometime between 1915 and 1920, Frank's parents, Tom and Annie Gates, moved the family to New Mexico. They built a dugout as living quarters that would suffice until they could build a house. Frank and Bess would begin their life together in this dugout, where they brought home 4 babies, Jay, Sis, B, and Nell, all born in McAlester. It was most likely there that they became acquainted with the Vance family. And Nell remembers her mother, Bess, once saying,
"Little Grandma Gates was the sweetest little angel there ever was."
It seems that she passed that on to Frank's oldest brother, Jakey. But Frank was number 9 of Tom and Annie's 11 children, and for whatever reason, did not inherit a full measure of his mother's sweetness. He was sociable with a sense of humor, but could be stern, and did not like his methods questioned. At home, he was cranky, was not without compassion, and had a soft spot for little kids. Nell remembers one time he brought home a tired, rough-looking character in need of a bath. He gave him a bar of soap and some old tattered rags to use as towels. The family barely had food for themselves, but Frank said to Bess, "He's hungry, Bess." All he asked for was a piece of bread and butter and a glass of milk. Bess delivered, and the man went on his way. By 1928, Bess's big brother Otis and his wife Hattie had carved out a good living on a farm they purchased in Caldwell, Idaho. While Tom and Annie stayed in New Mexico, several of Bess's siblings began to leave New Mexico to find their fortune in Idaho. Bess and Frank were among them. Bess's sweet mother, Ella, died of cancer in 1925, and it wasn't long before Willy Jay followed his offspring, who moved to Caldwell. Frank provided for the family as a farm laborer, most often working for Hattie's brother. Bess had a knack for turning a sow's ear into a silk purse, and the shack was a step up from the dugout, so she had no trouble making their new home comfortable. There was one major incident that occurred during their time in Wilder. Frank was stacking bales of hay that were loaded onto a truck by a pulley with a large hook that grabbed the bales and swung them onto the load. Somehow, the pulley swung over the truck without a bale and managed to catch Frank square in the left eye, removing it. He wore a glass eye for the rest of his life. His eyes would come by mail in a package of 6, and Joe and Kitty would be creeped out by how those eyes looked back at them, all lined up in the box. Frank would amuse himself by taking his eye out in front of his grandchildren, just to see the shock on their faces. Bess and Frank became fast friends with a family named Wes and Vina Clark that had moved from Canada and farmed 5 miles from where they lived in Wilder. Like Frank, Wes had done a tour of duty during the war, and it was he who suggested that they both enter the drawing for free land in Kittitas County, Washington.
I was fortunate in 2021 to be able to record an interview with my Aunt Jo and my Aunt Kitty. It wasn't the only stroke of luck. I discovered that my Aunt Nell's grandson, Kane Kalinsky, had also interviewed her. We'll have her tell the story of how they went from Wilder to Kittitas.
The United States government was opening land in the Oregon and Washington area to those who had served active duty. My dad's name was drawn then. This land, after he got it and we moved, he had 10 years to work this land and make it profitable. The year was 1934. It was Depression time. My dad, Frank B. Gates, had served in the U.S. Navy. He crossed over 7 times and he was never hurt. My mom and Aunt Hattie, I called her Nat Waddy, because I could not say Aunt Hattie. And she was as tall as she was round. And oh, she loved kids. Mom and Aunt Hattie made pressed chicken sandwiches. And we had a big sack of apples because we had no money to stop at a restaurant and eat. They took a large lard can and filled it full of pressed chicken sandwiches, clear to the top. And that was my seat from Wilder, Idaho to Kittitas, Washington.
Wow. About how big were these lard containers?
They were huge. And I had never tasted chicken sandwiches so good. Wes and Frank Montgomery, who had the farm next to Wes and Vina's, put up a shell of a house for us. It was all sagebrush and boulders and rock. And all this had to be cleaned out before they could farm it.
Kitty and Joe remember the Montgomery family.
That Frank Montgomery, another neighbor who lived right close to Clarkson, not very far from our farm, had helped frame up the house that they lived in.
The big old wife, Anna,
She was very tall,
very tall,
beautiful woman, very stately.
and you just wonder quite how she got up there.
Well, they had no children, and so she loved our family because I think she had always longed for a family. She was Norwegian, wasn't it, Joe? Do you remember her nationality? She had a bit of a brogue, a beautiful lady, and she would just, I know they just hurt at times knowing what poverty we lived in, because it really was poverty.
It was winter school break when Frank and Bess arrived in Kittitas. The Clark family had already built a small 2-bedroom house for themselves and their 3 children, and that was where Frank's family of 9 sheltered until their own house was framed. Wes Clark probably had some good motivation to get the Gates house framed quickly, as his house was nowhere near big enough for 14 people. Meanwhile, Bess's brother Otis back in Idaho had been keeping Frank's livestock until he built the structures necessary to contain them. The clock was ticking, and the family's very survival was contingent on getting a spring crop in the ground and a ditch dug at the entire top of the 80 acres so they could irrigate it. They needed the livestock to plant, and the ditch would be dug with sweat and a shovel. It was a lot of pressure. Frank most likely spent his last dime to ship the livestock. Nell recalls,
We had 2 teams of working horses and a cow. I think they killed all the chickens.
just what could have happened to those chickens.
My dad had to ride in the boxcar with the livestock. He had no money for a ticket. And he was going by this little town, and kids playing along the railroad tracks threw rocks at him and hit him. It just missed his brain. I don't know how many days it took to move the livestock, but when they got to Kittitas, my mom found that he had been injured.
Frank's injury was so severe that he was unable to work for nearly a full year, and so it fell to Bess and Jay to prepare the land for a crop of spring peas. Jay was only 12, but he and Bess planted 5 acres with a team of horses. It was their only means of income that year. Just as his grandfather Willy Jay had done before him, Jay became the man of the house. Food was scarce. Jay had once told Kitty they would have starved that year had it not been for an abundance of jackrabbits living in the sagebrush. Nell thought that Uncle Otis had provided them with a huge bag of beans, and the Clarks gave them potatoes. If Jay attended school that year, it would have been his last year, as he only had an 8th grade education. B, at age 10, carried some of the load, but he would go on to attend high school. They had a milk cow, but the milk would not have gone far every day among 9 family members. It was hard on Bess. Nell remembers Bess becoming overwhelmed while washing a wall and breaking into tears. The two were close, and she was beyond concerned. She asked her mother,
"Mama, what's wrong?"
Bess slumped to the floor and cried,
"I just can't have another baby right now."
Willy Gates was born in Kittitas in early 1936. Frank called her Kitty just because he liked the name and it stuck.